Long after midnight, when the world feels quieter than it should, there is a particular kind of silence that settles in. It is not empty. It hums faintly, as if something unseen is listening. In Japan, this hour has never been considered safe, empty, or meaningless. It is the hour when stories were born, not to frighten for sport, but to explain why the darkness sometimes feels crowded. There is an unsettling realization hidden in this belief, that the boundary between the living and the dead was never meant to be sealed shut. It was meant to breathe. Imagine walking home along a narrow street, where paper lanterns once flickered, their light trembling in the night air. The houses are quiet now, but they remember voices. In many cultures, ghosts are treated as remnants of the past, frozen in old legends. In Japan, they were treated more like neighbors who had simply changed form. This difference matters. It changes the tone of every story, every whisper passed down through generations. These tales were not told to shock. They were told to prepare the heart. The idea that the dead remain close is not born from fear alone. It grows from closeness. Families live together, generations under one roof, ancestors honored daily. When someone died, they did not vanish. Their presence shifted. Their absence was felt not as emptiness, but as weight. Over time, that weight gathered shape, emotion, and narrative. A ghost, in this context, was not a monster. It was a question left unanswered. As the night deepens, the mind naturally wanders toward things unresolved. Regrets grow louder. Memories sharpen. Japanese folklore understood this psychological truth long before modern science gave it language. Stories of spirits emerge from the same place insomnia does, from the mind circling something it cannot let go of. This is why these tales feel strangely intimate. They do not leap out screaming. They sit beside you and wait. There is a reason these stories were often told softly, in low voices, by candlelight. Loud fear fades quickly. Quiet unease lingers. In old Japan, gatherings were stretched late into the night, the air thick with incense and expectation. Each story peeled away another layer of comfort, not violently, but deliberately. The goal was never panic. It was awareness. When the final candle went out, what remained was not terror, but heightened sense of being alive. What makes Japanese haunted folklore feel different is its patience. The spirits do not rush. They drift. They observe. They wait for moments of emotional weakness rather than physical vulnerability. This reflects a deeper belief that danger does not always come from claws or teeth, but from unresolved feelings, betrayal, grief, jealousy, longing. These emotions were believed to stain the soul so deeply that even death could not wash them away. Consider how unsettling it is to realize that many of these stories were not warnings about strangers, but about loved ones. A spouse wronged, a parent neglected, a promise broken. The haunting did not begin with death. Death merely removed the restraints. In this way, Japanese folklore quietly suggests something uncomfortable, that the most terrifying things are born from human behavior, not supernatural cruelty. As centuries passed, cities modernized, and lights grew brighter, the stories did not disappear. They adapted. Trains replaced lanterns. Apartment buildings replaced wooden homes. But the feeling remained. People still avoided certain paths at night, still felt watched in empty spaces, still spoke of places where the air felt heavy for no visible reason. Even today, many will admit, quietly, that some corners of the world feel unwilling to forget. There is comfort in this continuity. If ghosts exist, then memories matter. If spirits linger, then lives leave echoes. For a culture shaped by earthquakes, fires, and sudden loss, this belief softened the finality of death. It suggested that nothing meaningful truly vanished. It only changed form. Fear and comfort became entwined, inseparable. As you listen now, perhaps with eyes heavy and thoughts slowing, it is worth noticing how these stories affect you. They do not demand belief. They invite reflection. They ask what parts of ourselves we would leave behind if we could not let go. What emotions would tether us to the world we once knew? This is why Japan's most haunted folklore has never truly slept. It lives in pauses, in silences, in the moments just before rest. It surfaces when the mind loosens its grip on the present and drifts backward inward. These stories are companions to the night, not intruders. They remind us that darkness is not empty, and that even fear, when understood, can be gentle. As the night stretches on and the world outside grows still, these whispers do not grow louder. They grow closer, not to harm, but to remind that the line between what was and what remains is thin, that stories once told never truly fade, and that sometimes the most haunted places are not old houses or forgotten roads, but the quiet spaces we carry within us, waiting patiently to be acknowledged before sleep finally arrives. To understand why ghosts felt inevitable in Japan, one must first step into a world where the boundary between the visible and invisible was never sharply drawn. Long before cities rose and calendars were standardized, life moved according to seasons, weather, and forces that could not be controlled. Mountains loomed like silent witnesses. Rivers gave life and took it away without warning. Earthquakes arrived without apology. In such a landscape, it felt natural to believe that unseen presences shared the world with the living, shaping events quietly from behind the veil. In early Japan, the world was not divided into sacred and ordinary. Everything carried spirit. Stones, trees, wind, fire, and water were all believed to possess an essence, a quiet awareness. This worldview did not come from fear, but from observation. When a storm destroyed a village or a harvest failed despite careful planning, it seemed logical that forces beyond human will were at work. These forces were not always hostile. Many were neutral, some benevolent, others unpredictable. Respect, rather than control, became the guiding principle. This way of seeing the world formed the heart of Shinto belief, though it was not originally a structured religion. It was simply how people understood their place in existence. Kami, often translated as spirits or gods, were not distant rulers demanding obedience. They were present everywhere, inhabiting natural features and ancestral lines alike. A towering cedar tree could be a kami. So could the spirit of a long-dead grandparent. Life and afterlife overlapped, woven together so tightly that separation felt artificial. When Buddhism arrived in Japan centuries later, it did not replace this worldview. It settled into it, like mist filling a valley. Buddhism introduced ideas of impermanence, suffering, and rebirth, offering language for pain and loss that people already felt deeply. Death was no longer just a transition. It was part of a long emotional journey shaped by attachment and desire. If someone died with unresolved feelings, those feelings mattered. They had weight. They could influence what came next. This blending of beliefs created a unique spiritual landscape. Ancestors were honored daily, not as distant memories, but as ongoing participants in family life. Small household altars held offerings of food, incense, and prayer. These gestures were not grand acts of worship. They were quiet acknowledgments, a way of saying, "You are still with us." When someone passed away, their absence was not absolute. Their role simply changed. Because of this closeness, death was never entirely clean. Grief lingered, regret lingered, love lingered, and where emotions lingered, so did the possibility of spiritual unrest. A peaceful death led to a peaceful presence, but a violent end, a betrayal, or deep injustice could disturb that balance. The soul, burdened by emotion, might fail to move on smoothly. In this belief, ghosts were not intruders from another world. They were souls caught between states, held in place by feelings too strong to dissolve. This understanding shaped how people lived. Actions mattered not just socially, but spiritually. Kindness was not only moral, it was preventative. To wrong someone deeply was to risk consequences that extended beyond death. Apologies, rituals, and memorials were not empty gestures. They were attempts to restore harmony, to soothe what might otherwise become restless. Even the physical layout of villages reflected this thinking. Burial sites were placed carefully. Sacred forests were left untouched. Certain paths were avoided at night, not because something was guaranteed to be there, but because it might be. The unknown was treated with caution rather than denial. Silence itself became meaningful. A sudden stillness was not ignored. It was noticed. Over time, stories emerged as a way to make sense of these beliefs. They were not formal teachings. They were shared experiences, passed quietly from one generation to the next. A story about a spirit was also a story about behavior, about what happens when promises are broken, about what happens when grief is ignored, about what happens when emotions are left to fester in the dark. What is striking is how little emphasis was placed on defeating ghosts. There were rituals to calm them, to guide them, to acknowledge their pain. Exorcism existed, but it was not always the goal. Often, understanding came first. Why is the spirit here? What does it want? What was left unfinished? In many stories, once the truth was recognized, the haunting softened or ceased entirely. Resolution, not destruction, was a desired outcome. This approach mirrors a deeper cultural relationship with emotion. Feelings were not something to be expelled quickly. They were endured, reflected upon, and slowly integrated. Sorrow was given space. Anger was recognized as dangerous when suppressed. Love was treated as something powerful enough to transcend reason. Ghost stories became emotional maps, guiding people through experiences that language alone struggled to explain. As night falls, this worldview feels almost intuitive. In darkness, the senses sharpen. The mind fills gaps with memory and imagination. A creaking sound becomes significant. A shadow feels intentional. Japanese folklore did not dismiss these sensations as childish. It gave them meaning. It suggested that awareness itself was a form of respect. This is why the living and the dead were believed to share the same world, not as enemies, but as cohabitants. One group visible, the other not. One bound by breath, the other by memory. The relationship was delicate, maintained through ritual, storytelling, and attention. When balance was kept, life flowed smoothly. When it was disturbed, echoes followed. Understanding the spiritual landscape changes how the stories feel. They are no longer simply tales of fear. They become reflections of a culture deeply attuned to emotional consequence. They suggest that nothing truly disappears without being acknowledged, that silence can be heavy, and that the world, even when it appears still, is quietly listening. As the night deepens and the mind begins to loosen its grip on waking logic, these ideas settle gently. They do not demand belief. They ask for awareness. They invite you to imagine a world where every action leaves a trace, and where even after death, the human heart may take time to let go. In such a world, ghosts are not anomalies. They are reminders, soft, persistent, and impossible to fully forget. There is a moment in many Japanese ghost stories when fear does not arrive all at once. Instead, it seeps in slowly, carried by a realization rather than shock. This is especially true in stories of vengeful spirits, known as onryo, whose origins lie not in malice, but in pain left unresolved. To understand them is to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the most destructive forces are often born from injustice, not cruelty. In life, these individuals were rarely powerful. They were wives cast aside, servants mistreated, lovers betrayed, or citizens wronged by those above them. Their suffering was quiet, endured rather than expressed. Social expectations demanded silence, obedience, and restraint. Anger had no safe outlet. Grief had no witness. Over time, these emotions compressed inward, growing heavier, sharper, more dangerous. Death, instead of releasing them, became the breaking point. In Japanese belief, emotions carried weight. They were not abstract experiences that vanished with the body. They clung to the soul. A peaceful heart could pass on gently, guided by ritual and remembrance. But a heart twisted by betrayal or humiliation could not let go so easily. The spirit lingered, tethered to the moment it was wronged, replaying it endlessly. This lingering was not a choice. It was a consequence. The onryo did not rise, seeking revenge in a dramatic sense. They emerged because balance had been shattered. Their presence was a symptom, not a cause. Crops failed. Illness spread. Accidents multiplied. These misfortunes were not immediately attributed to a visible ghost, but to spiritual imbalance. Only later did stories give these forces a face, a history, and a name. The haunting was the final chapter of a much longer human story. What makes onryo especially unsettling is that they did not discriminate. Once transformed, their suffering spilled outward, affecting not only those responsible, but anyone nearby. This reflected a deep cultural anxiety. that unresolved wrongs poison entire communities. Harm was not isolated. It radiated. In this way, Onryo were moral lessons embodied in fear. They warned that injustice ignored would eventually demand attention one way or another. Their appearance in folklore is strikingly consistent. Long black hair, pale skin, white burial robes. These were not arbitrary choices. Hair left unbound symbolized disorder, a rejection of social norms. White was the color of death, but also of ritual purity. The image suggested a soul caught between states, neither fully corrupted nor at peace. The Onryo was both victim and threat, deserving sympathy and fear in equal measure. Unlike many supernatural beings, Onryo could not be easily banished. Strength meant nothing against them. Weapons were useless. What they demanded was recognition, truth, apology, ritual. In some stories, priests failed because they treated the spirit as an enemy rather than a wound. Only when the living acknowledged the wrong and named it openly did the haunting weaken. This idea runs quietly through the folklore, reinforcing belief that denial only deepens unrest. The emotional weight of these stories is what makes them linger in the mind. They do not offer the comfort of clear villains and heroes. Often, the person responsible never intended harm. Indifference was enough. Silence was enough. The story suggests that neglect can be as damaging as violence, and far more common. This realization unsettles not because it is fantastical, but because it feels familiar. As time passed, historical events fed into these beliefs. Epidemics, fires, political upheaval. When disaster struck, people searched for emotional causes as much as physical ones. Powerful Onryo were blamed for national calamities, their anger thought capable of shaking the natural order itself. In response, shrines were built, titles bestowed, honors given to appease these spirits. Fear transformed into reverence. The wronged dead became protectors once properly acknowledged. This transformation reveals something gentle beneath the horror. Even the most vengeful spirit could be soothed. Rage was not eternal. It was a state born of neglect. Given care, it could soften. This belief offered hope in a world where justice was often delayed or denied. If balance could not be restored in life, perhaps it could be restored after death. As the night grows quieter, the idea of the Onryo takes on a different tone. It becomes less about fear and more about consequence. What emotions are left unattended? What apologies remain unspoken? These stories ask the listener to reflect inwardly, without accusation. They suggest that peace is fragile, maintained not by force, but by empathy and awareness. In this sense, Onryo are not monsters lurking in darkness. They are mirrors, reflecting what happens when pain is ignored too long. Their stories endure because they speak to something universal, the human need to be seen, heard, and acknowledged. When that need is denied, it does not disappear. It waits. As you drift deeper into stillness, the image of the Onryo may soften, no longer a figure of terror, but a presence shaped by sorrow, a reminder that every action leaves a trace, and every emotion seeks resolution. In the quiet hours, when the world feels thin and memory drifts freely, these stories whisper a simple truth, that peace in life or death is never accidental. It must be tended to gently before unrest learns how to linger. There are some stories that do not rush toward their horror. They begin gently, almost tenderly, as if inviting trust before revealing the cost of breaking it. The tale of Oiwa unfolds this way, not as a sudden nightmare, but as a slow tightening of fate shaped by ordinary human weakness. What makes it endure is not the supernatural elements alone, but how recognizable the emotions feel even centuries later. Oiwa was not powerful. She did not command armies or shape history. She was a woman whose life narrowed quietly, shaped by marriage, illness, and dependence. In a society where a woman's worth was often measured by obedience and endurance, she did what was expected of her. She trusted, and that trust became her undoing. This is where the story begins to grow heavy, because betrayal in folklore rarely arrives without warning. It arrives disguised as necessity. Her husband, driven by ambition and impatience, saw her not as a partner, but as an obstacle. Oiwa's illness became an inconvenience. Her loyalty became something to exploit. In many retellings, he does not strike her down in rage. He poisons her slowly, hiding cruelty behind practicality. This detail matters. The harm is deliberate, but quiet. It mirrors how betrayal often works in real life, through small choices that feel justifiable in the moment. As the poison takes hold, Oiwa's reflection begins to change. Her face distorts. Her hair falls out in uneven clumps. But what is truly unsettling is not the physical transformation. It is the emotional realization that she understands what is happening. She sees herself becoming something unwanted, discarded, and yet she remains bound by love and dependence. There is no dramatic confrontation, only a growing awareness that she has been sacrificed for convenience. When Oiwa dies, the story does not release its tension. It deepens it. Death, instead of ending her suffering, crystallizes it. The betrayal becomes permanent, sealed by finality. In Japanese belief, this is the moment when a spirit's fate is decided. A peaceful passing allows the soul to move on, but Oiwa's death is neither peaceful nor just. Her emotions, shock, grief, rage, have nowhere to go. They anchor her to the world she was pushed out of. The haunting that follows is not immediate chaos. It is intimate. Oiwa appears to her husband not as a roaring demon, but as a reminder he cannot escape. In lantern light, in mirrors, in the face of another woman, her presence surfaces. This choice is deliberate. Mirrors reflect truth. Lanterns expose what darkness hides. Oiwa does not chase. She reveals. Each appearance forces him to confront what he has done, again and again, without relief. What makes this haunting so effective is its restraint. The husband's life unravels not because Oiwa attacks him, but because guilt and fear erode his sanity. The boundaries between reality and apparition blur. He can no longer trust his own perception. This psychological descent is more frightening than any physical violence. It suggests that the greatest punishment is not death, but living with unacknowledged wrongdoing. In some versions, his attempts to move on only deepen the curse. Each step away from responsibility tightens the hold of the haunting. The message is clear and unyielding. Avoidance is not escape. This reflects a broader cultural understanding that emotional debts cannot be abandoned. They follow, they accumulate interest, and eventually they demand payment. Oiwa's spirit does not seek random destruction. Her focus is narrow, personal. This specificity makes her more tragic than monstrous. She is not punishing the world. She is responding to a singular betrayal that defined her final moments. In this way, she becomes one of the most human ghosts in Japanese folklore. Her power does not come from supernatural strength, but from emotional truth. Over time, the story of Oiwa moved beyond oral tradition. It became theater, retold on stage with careful ritual. Actors performed the role with respect, offering prayers before and after performances. This practice was not superstition alone. It was acknowledgement. The belief that a teller's story carelessly invited misfortune suggests that even fictional retellings carried emotional weight. The story itself was treated as something alive. This respect reveals how deeply the tale resonated. Oiwa was not feared simply because she was dangerous. She was feared because she was right. The haunting is framed not as injustice, but as consequence. This distinction matters. It shifts the listener's allegiance. Sympathy lies with the ghost, not the living. The story challenges the instinct to side with survival over morality. As centuries passed, Oiwa's image became iconic. Pale face, distorted features, hanging hair. Yet even as her appearance hardened into visual shorthand, the emotional core remained unchanged. She represented the cost of betrayal hidden behind social respectability. A reminder that harm committed quietly is still harm, and often more devastating for its subtlety. Listening to her story in the quiet hours, it is difficult not to reflect inwardly, not on grand betrayals, but on small ones, words withheld, trust taken for granted, moments when convenience outweighed compassion. The story does not accuse. It invites recognition. It suggests that the line between peace and haunting is thinner than it appears. As the night settles deeper, Oiwa's presence lingers not as fear, but as weight, a soft pressure of awareness. Her story does not end with resolution or forgiveness. It ends with the understanding that some wounds, once inflicted, change the shape of the world permanently, and that acknowledgement, even late, is the only thing that can quiet what has been awakened. In this way, Oiwa's tale endures not because it frightens, but because it remembers. It carries forward the idea that love mishandled becomes something dangerous, and that betrayal leaves echoes long after the voices involved have fallen silent. As sleep approaches, the story remains, not demanding attention, but waiting patiently, like all unresolved things do, just beneath the surface of rest. When people imagine a Japanese ghost, the image often appears instantly and without explanation. A pale figure in a white robe, long black hair hanging forward, obscuring the face, feet that never quite touch the ground. These details feel ancient, as if they have always existed this way. But they did not emerge randomly. They were shaped slowly, through ritual, belief, and the quiet language of mourning. To understand a Yurei is to understand how grief was given form. In life, death in Japan was handled with careful structure. The body was washed, dressed, and prepared according to custom. White burial robes were chosen not because they were eerie, but because white symbolized purity and transition. It marked the soul's departure from one state of being to another. The clothing was not meant to frighten. It was meant to guide. When Yurei appear in these same garments, it suggests something deeply unsettling, that the journey was interrupted. The ritual was performed, but the spirit did not arrive where it was meant to go. Hair holds its own meaning. In daily life, hair was bound, styled, controlled. Order was visible. To appear with hair hanging loose signaled disorder, a breaking away from social expectations. It was how the grieving looked when decorum fell away, when emotion overpowered restraint. The Yurei's hair reflects this collapse. It is not style for terror. It is style for sorrow. It tells the story of a soul no longer governed by the rules of the living. Then there is the way Yurei move, or rather, how they do not. Traditional depictions show them floating, their lower bodies fading into nothing. This is not a detail meant to impress. It speaks to incompletion. Feet connect us to the ground, to direction, to progress. A spirit without feet cannot walk forward. It drifts, bound to a place, a moment, or memory. This imagery turns haunting into metaphor. The Yurei is stuck because something within them remains unresolved. These visual elements were reinforced through art and performance. Woodblock prints, theater costumes, and later film all repeated the same language, not to standardize fear, but to preserve meaning. Over time, these symbols became instantly recognizable, even to those unfamiliar with their origins. The image carried emotional information. One glance was enough to understand that the spirit was not at rest. Unlike many ghosts in other traditions, Yurei rarely appear aggressive at first. They are seen standing silently, watching. Their presence is often revealed gradually, a reflection that lingers too long, a shadow where none should be, a figure glimpsed out of the corner of the eye. This restraint mirrors how grief itself behaves. It does not always announce itself. It waits for quiet moments, then rises unexpectedly. The reason these spirits linger is not always vengeance. Sometimes it is love that refuses to dissolve. A parent watching over a child. A lover unable to let go. A promise unfinished. In these stories, the Yurei's presence can be unsettling without being hostile. Fear mixes with sadness. The living are not always in danger, but they are always affected. The haunting becomes a reminder of emotional bonds that death could not sever. Ritual played a crucial role in addressing these presences. When a Yurei appeared, the response was rarely to confront it violently. Instead, offerings were made, prayers spoken, names remembered. The living were taught that acknowledgement could soothe what fear could not. This approach reflects a belief that unrest is often a result of neglect rather than malice. When the spirit was recognized, its form could soften, its appearances could fade. This belief shaped how people lived their lives. Funerals were not rushed. Memorial services were repeated on anniversaries. Families returned to graves regularly. These acts were not only for the dead, but for the living. They reinforced the idea that grief, when tended to, does not rot into something dangerous. The Yurei existed as a warning of what happens when remembrance fails. As these stories traveled through generations, they adapted. The Edo period brought increased storytelling, theater, and art. The image of the Yurei became more refined, more dramatic. But even as aesthetics evolved, the emotional logic remained intact. The ghost was still defined by attachment. Its form still reflected unfinished business. The fear inspired was still rooted in empathy as much as dread. In modern times, these images have spread far beyond Japan, often stripped of their original context. The white dress becomes a costume. The long hair becomes a jump scare. Yet something of the original meaning lingers. Even without explanation, the image feels heavy. The silence around the Yurei feels intentional. It suggests a story that began before we arrived and will continue after we leave. Listening to these descriptions in the quiet hours, it becomes clear why they are so effective for nighttime storytelling. They do not demand attention. They drift into the mind, settling gently. They mirror the way thoughts behave as sleep approaches, unfinished, emotionally charged, floating without direction. The Yurei becomes less a figure of fear and more a reflection of the mind itself when it cannot rest. There's a strange comfort in this. If ghosts exist, then grief is acknowledged. If spirits linger, then love leaves a trace. The Yurei embodies the idea that emotions matter enough to shape reality, that nothing deeply felt disappears without consequence. This belief softens the fear, transforming it into something contemplative. As the night deepens and the world grows still, the image of the Yurei remains quietly present, not looming, not threatening, simply waiting. It asks no questions and offers no answers. It reminds us that rest comes easier when the heart is light, and that unresolved feelings, like restless spirits, will drift until they are gently laid to rest. Once each year, as summer reaches its fullest warmth, the boundary between worlds is believed to soften. The air grows heavy, cicadas hum without pause, and evenings stretch long and slow. This is a season of Oban, a time not of fear, but of welcome. While many ghost stories speak of spirits who linger uninvited, Oban tells a different story, one where the dead are expected, guided home by light and memory. The idea behind Oban is simple and deeply human. Those who came before us do not vanish. They return, briefly, to visit the places they loved and the people who remember them. This belief transforms haunting into reunion. Instead of shadows creeping through empty rooms, there are footsteps returning to familiar floors. Instead of unease, there is preparation. Homes are cleaned. Altars are refreshed. Favorite foods are set out, not as offerings demanded by fear, but as gestures of affection. Lanterns play a central role in this ritual. As dusk falls, their warm glow begins at streets, doorways, and riverbanks. These lights are not decorative. They are guides. Each lantern is meant to show a spirit the way home, to prevent it from becoming lost in the darkness between worlds. There is something profoundly gentle in this image, a society pausing to ensure that even the dead do not wander alone. During these nights, storytelling takes on a softer tone. Children hear tales of ancestors, not monsters. The dead are spoken of by name, their habits recalled, their laughter remembered. In this way, Oban becomes a collective act of remembrance. It reinforces a belief that forgetting is more dangerous than death. A spirit remembered is a spirit at peace. Dance is also part of the season. Bon Odori, performed in open spaces, brings communities together in slow, repetitive movements. The steps are simple, designed for everyone. There is no performance, no audience, only participation. The dance is said to honor the spirits, but also serves the living. Moving together in rhythm dissolves distance between neighbors, between generations, between past and present. What stands out in Oban is its emotional balance. It acknowledges loss without drowning in it. Grief is present, but it is shared, lightened by community. There is sadness, but also gratitude. This balance reflects a broader cultural understanding. That sorrow, when embraced openly, loses its sharp edges. It becomes something that can be carried. At the end of Oban, the lanterns return to the water. Rivers and seas glow briefly as floating lights drift away, carrying spirits back to their resting place. This moment is often quiet, reflective. The farewell is not dramatic. It is tender. There is no sense of banishment. Only the understanding that visits, by their nature, must end. This ritual offers a powerful contrast to the restless spirits of folklore. While Onryo and Uri linger because something went wrong, the spirits of Oban return because something was done right. They are invited. They are acknowledged. Their stories are told. The difference lies not in the nature of the spirit, but in the response of the living. Oban also serves as a reminder of responsibility. The care given during these days is believed to influence the year ahead. Harmony maintained now prevents unrest later. In this way, Oban is not just remembrance, it is maintenance of balance, a yearly renewal of the bond between worlds. As modern life accelerates, Oban remains. Even in cities lit by neon and screens, lanterns still glow. Trains still carry people back to hometowns. Graves are still cleaned. The ritual adapts without losing its heart. This continuity suggests that some needs do not change with time. The need to remember, to honor, to feel connected beyond a single lifetime. Listening to these traditions in the quiet hours, they feel deeply calming. There is reassurance in the idea that not all spirits wander in pain, that some return briefly, content, surrounded by care. It reframes the supernatural not as a threat, but as an extension of family. As night settles and the mind drifts, Oban offers a gentle image to hold on to. Lanterns floating softly on dark water. Voices murmuring names. Dances moving slowly under summer skies. It is a reminder that peace is possible, even in a world shaped by loss. That when the living remember with kindness, the dead do not need to linger. And that sometimes the most comforting ghost stories are not about fear at all, but about welcome. Cold has a way of making silence feel heavier. In the mountains and forests of Japan, winter transforms familiar landscapes into something distant and unforgiving. Snow absorbs sound. Wind cuts through breath. In this stillness, stories of Yukiana were born, not shouted around fires, but whispered as if the cold itself were listening. She is not introduced with violence, but with beauty, and that is what makes her so dangerous. Yukiana appears during snowstorms, when paths vanish and direction is lost. Travelers speak of a tall, pale woman gliding across the snow without leaving footprints. Her kimono blends seamlessly with the landscape, white against white, her face calm and expressionless. There is no urgency in her movements. She does not chase. She waits. This patience mirrors the environment she belongs to. Winter does not rush. It simply endures until weakness reveals itself. What sets Yukiana apart from other spirits is her ambiguity. In some stories, she freezes travelers where they stand, draining warmth with a breath as soft as falling snow. In others, she spares the young or the innocent, disappearing without harm. This inconsistency is unsettling. There are no clear rules, no guarantees. Survival depends not on strength, but on circumstance, on mercy, on chance. This reflects a deeper truth about nature itself. Mountains do not hate climbers. Snow does not choose its victims. And yet people die every winter. Yukiana personifies this reality. She is not a villain with intent. She is an embodiment of cold, beautiful, lethal, indifferent. To encounter her is to face the limits of human control. Some versions of her story take a softer turn. A man meets Yukiana during a storm and survives, spared with a single condition: never speak of her. Years later, he marries a woman who is gentle, quiet, and pale. They build a life together. Children are born. Time passes. One winter night, he breaks his promise and tells her the story of Yukiana. In that moment, her true nature is revealed. She does not kill him. She leaves. Love could not erase what she was, but it could delay the inevitable. This version of the tale shifts the fear inward. The danger is no longer the storm, but memory, the idea that love can exist between worlds, but only under fragile conditions. Trust, once broken, cannot be repaired. The cold returns, not with violence, but with absence. Yukiana's beauty is central to her legend. It draws people closer, rather than driving them away. This contrasts sharply with other spirits whose monstrous forms warn of danger. With Yukiana, there is no warning. This reflects how cold kills in reality, not dramatically, but quietly, lulling the body into sleep. The stories mirror this physiological truth. Victims feel calm before they freeze. Fear fades. Awareness softens. In this way, Yukiana becomes a sleep story in itself. She arrives in stillness, encourages rest, and blurs the line between sleep and death. The terror lies not in pain, but in surrender. This makes her one of the most haunting figures in Japanese folklore, not because she is cruel, but because she is gentle. Her presence also reflects social themes. In a world where women were expected to be quiet, beautiful, and obedient, Yukiana embodies those expectations taken to an extreme. She is silent, composed, and deadly when underestimated. The stories carry an unspoken warning. What appears delicate may hold immense power. As centuries passed, Yukiana's image softened further. She appeared in art, poetry, and later film, often portrayed with sadness rather than malice. She became a symbol of loneliness, of seasons passing without return. Winter ends, but she remains unchanged. Eternal cold, eternal youth, eternal distance. Listening to her story late at night, it is easy to feel its pull, the quiet, the whiteness, the idea of letting go into something cold and still. Yet the story resists romanticization. Every version reminds us that survival requires awareness. That beauty without warmth is not comfort. That rest without return is final. As the night deepens, Yukiana drifts through the mind like snow through moonlight, not threatening, not comforting, simply present. She reminds us that some forces cannot be reasoned with or defeated. They must be respected, observed, and understood from a distance. In the end, Yukiana is not just a ghost story. She is a lesson wrapped in frost. A reminder that nature, like emotion, does not announce its danger loudly. It waits, serene and patient, until we forget how fragile warmth truly is. There are stories in Japanese folklore where fear takes a step back and something quieter moves forward. Not terror, not violence, but longing. These are the tales where humans fall in love with spirits, where the boundary between worlds thins not through tragedy, but through affection. Yet even in these gentler stories, an unease remains, because love across worlds is never simple and never without cost. Often, these stories begin in ordinary loneliness. A traveler shelters from rain. A widower lives quietly at the edge of a village. A man or woman feels disconnected from the rhythm of those around them. It is in these moments of emotional openness that spirits appear, not with threats, but with companionship. They listen. They understand. They fill a silence that has grown too large. The spirit lovers in these tales rarely reveal their true nature at first. They appear human, indistinguishable in voice and gesture. This is not deception for cruelty's sake. It reflects a belief that spirits, like humans, long for connection. To reveal themselves too early would end the bond before it could begin. So the relationship unfolds naturally. Shared meals, quiet evenings, growing trust. For a time, these unions feel peaceful. Life improves. Homes feel warmer. Loneliness recedes. In some stories, children are born, blurring the line between worlds even further. This is where the stories grow emotionally complex. Love is real. Happiness is genuine. And yet, something remains unsaid. The tension often lies in a single condition. Do not ask where I go at night. Do not speak of this to anyone. Do not look into that room. These requests are not arbitrary. They protect the fragile balance that allows a relationship to exist. Curiosity, while human, becomes dangerous. Not because knowledge is forbidden, but because exposure collapses the space between worlds too abruptly. When the condition is broken, the consequences are rarely violent. The spirit does not lash out. Instead, revelation occurs. The lover is exposed as something other, and the bond dissolves. The spirit leaves not in anger, but in sorrow. Love could exist, but only in secrecy. Once named, it could not survive. These stories reflect a quiet truth about relationships, that some connections thrive only under specific circumstances. That complete understanding is not always possible. That love sometimes requires acceptance of mystery. The supernatural element amplifies this idea, turning emotional boundaries into literal ones. In some variations, the spirit lover is an animal spirit, a fox, a crane, a snake, taking human form. These tales emphasize gratitude and reciprocity. A human shows kindness without expectation. The spirit repays it through companionship. But again, the balance is fragile. When the spirit's true nature is revealed, often through curiosity or betrayal, the relationship ends. The emotional aftermath is significant. The human is not punished with death, but with absence. Life continues, but something irreplaceable is gone. The story lingers on this loss, allowing the listener to feel its weight. Love with the spirit leaves a deeper imprint than ordinary love, because it crosses a boundary that can never be crossed again. These tales also explore the idea that the supernatural is not inherently hostile. Spirits are capable of affection, loyalty, and sacrifice. They are not monsters wearing human skin. They are beings bound by different rules. When those rules are broken, separation is inevitable, not because of malice, but because balance demands it. At night, these stories feel especially potent. They do not disturb sleep with fear. They stir reflection. They invite listeners to consider their own boundaries, their own secrets, their own unspoken conditions in relationships. The supernatural becomes a mirror for emotional reality. What makes these stories endure is their restraint. They do not escalate into chaos. They end quietly. A door left open, a bed left empty, a memory that never fades. This quiet ending aligns perfectly with bedtime storytelling. It does not jar the listener awake. It settles into the mind like a half-remembered dream. Over time, these tales influence broader folklore. They soften the image of spirits, complicating the idea of haunting. Not all spirits sought revenge. Some sought companionship. Some sought warmth. Some simply wanted to be seen as more than remnants of the dead. As the night deepens and thoughts slow, these stories offer a gentle reminder that love is powerful enough to bridge worlds, but fragile enough to break at the slightest misstep. That some connections, once lost, leave echoes that never fully fade. And that sometimes the most haunting stories are not those filled with fear, but those filled with love that could not last. Fear does not always arrive with sharp edges. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it laughs. Sometimes it slips quietly into everyday life, wearing a face that is almost friendly. In Japanese folklore, this softer, stranger side of fear takes shape in yokai, creatures born not from pure terror, but from curiosity, mischief, and the uneasy spaces of ordinary experience. They are not ghosts in the traditional sense. They are something older, closer, and often more familiar. Yokai emerged from the parts of life that resisted explanation. A sound in the attic, a tool that seemed to move on its own, a shadow that lingered a second too long. In a world without electric light or scientific certainty, imagination filled the gaps, but it did so creatively rather than catastrophically. Not every unexplained thing became a demon. Some became tricksters. Some became warnings. Some became jokes told to children with just enough seriousness to make them behave. What separates yokai from darker spirits is their relationship with humans. They interact. They interfere. They tease. A yokai might steal food, play harmless tricks, or frighten someone just enough to remind them to be careful. Their actions rarely feel personal. They are not fueled by grief or revenge. They simply exist alongside humans, sharing the same spaces but following different rules. Many yokai are tied to everyday objects and places. An old umbrella left neglected becomes something that hops and grins. A teapot used for years gains awareness. A bridge crossed at night acquires a presence that demands respect. These stories suggest that neglect itself can create imbalance. Objects, like people, require attention. When ignored too long, they may behave unexpectedly. This idea carries a subtle moral lesson. Treat your surroundings with care. Pay attention. Respect what you use. The supernatural consequence is playful rather than terrifying, but the message remains. Disorder invites disruption. In this way, yokai folklore teaches mindfulness without preaching. Their appearances are often exaggerated, even absurd. Long noses, enormous eyes, twisted limbs. These designs invite laughter as much as unease. They break tension. Fear becomes approachable. This balance is crucial. It allows stories to be shared openly, even with children, without overwhelming them. Fear is introduced gently, as something manageable. Yet beneath this playfulness lies something deeper. Yokai reflect the unpredictability of life. They appear when least expected. They disrupt routine. They remind humans that control is an illusion. No matter how carefully one plans, something unexpected will always slip through. Over time, yokai became woven into cultural expression. Artists depicted them in scrolls. Storytellers gave them personalities. They became part of festivals, costumes, and games. This familiarity diluted fear, transforming it into fascination. Children learned their names. Adults smiled at their antics. Fear was domesticated. This does not mean yokai were harmless. Some could be dangerous if disrespected. Some punished greed, arrogance, or carelessness. But even then, the punishment felt proportional. A lesson learned, not a life destroyed. This contrasts sharply with vengeful spirits, whose suffering spills beyond intention. Yokai stories also reveal a cultural comfort with ambiguity. These creatures are rarely fully explained. Their origins vary. Their behavior changes from story to story. This inconsistency is accepted. It mirrors real life, where not everything fits neatly into categories. Rather than forcing clarity, folklore embraced uncertainty. At night, this makes yokai stories particularly soothing. They do not demand emotional intensity. They drift. They amuse. They unsettle just enough to keep the mind engaged without causing distress. They are perfect companions for the moments before sleep, when thoughts wander freely. As modernity arrived, yokai adapted. They appeared in urban legends, comics, animation. Their forms evolved, but their role remained the same. They bridged the gap between fear and familiarity. They reminded people that imagination still had a place in a rational world. Listening to these stories now, in a quiet room, it is easy to see their appeal. They do not insist on belief. They invite play. They suggest that the world is slightly stranger than it appears, and that this strangeness can be delightful rather than threatening. In this way, yokai represent fear that has learned to coexist with humans. Fear that has been named, drawn, laughed at. Fear that no longer paralyzes, but educates. They teach caution without panic, respect without dread. As the night deepens, these smiling creatures linger at the edges of thought, not to frighten, but to remind that the unknown is not always an enemy, that curiosity and caution can exist together, and that sometimes the best way to live with fear is to let it smile back at you. There is a particular kind of fear that does not come from darkness, but from familiarity. It emerges when something you trust begins to feel slightly wrong, when the ordinary reveals a hidden flaw. In Japanese folklore, few stories capture this quiet unease better than that of the Rokuro Kubi, beings who appear completely human by day, yet reveal their true nature only when night loosens the rules of the world. At first, there is nothing to distinguish them. They cook meals, share conversations, laugh softly, and move through daily routines without suspicion. This is what makes the revelation so unsettling. The danger is not lurking in forests or abandoned places. It sits at the table. It pours tea. It listens to your worries. The story does not warn against strangers. It warns against assumptions. When night falls, the transformation is subtle, almost graceful. The neck begins to stretch, lengthening unnaturally, carrying the head away from the sleeping body. Sometimes it snakes through doorways. Sometimes it peers from ceilings or windows. The body remains still, vulnerable, unaware. This separation is the heart of the fear. Mind and body divided. Appearance and truth no longer aligned. Unlike vengeful spirits, Rokuro Kubi are not always malicious. Some do not choose what they are. In certain tales, they are cursed, unaware of their condition. In others, they feed on human energy or fear, drawn to those who sleep nearby. This inconsistency deepens the unease. The listener cannot rely on clear rules. Safety depends not on intention, but on circumstance. The symbolism beneath these stories is powerful. The stretching neck represents overextension, reaching too far, observing where one should not. It suggests a fear of surveillance, of being watched in moments of vulnerability. In a society that valued privacy and restraint, the idea of being observed, while consent struck deeply. These stories also reflect anxiety around trust within households. In tightly knit communities, where privacy was limited and lives intertwined, the possibility that someone close could harbor a hidden danger was profoundly unsettling. The Rokurokubi made that fear visible. It gave shape to suspicion without accusation. At the same time, many tales portray Rokurokubi with sadness rather than cruelty. They hide their condition out of shame. They avoid sleeping near others. They fear discovery as much as humans fear them. In these versions, the monster is also a victim. This duality complicates the fear. Pity and dread coexist, creating emotional tension that lingers. As night deepens, the image becomes more potent. The long neck drifting silently through darkness mirrors the mind wandering during sleeplessness. Thoughts stretch beyond control. Worries drift away from the body, exploring corners they were never meant to reach. The Rokurokubi becomes a metaphor for the restless mind itself. The stories often end quietly. Discovery leads to separation, not destruction. The Rokurokubi leaves, or the household disperses. Life resumes, altered but intact. This restraint aligns with the broader tone of Japanese folklore, where balance is restored not through violence, but through acknowledgement and distance. Visually, the image is striking, but the true fear lies in its restraint. There is no blood, no chaos, only the slow realization that something trusted is not what it seemed. This kind of fear is difficult to shake because it feels plausible. It does not rely on supernatural logic alone. It taps into everyday anxiety. Over time, the Rokurokubi evolve in art and storytelling. Sometimes the neck stretches, sometimes the head detaches completely. Variations emerge, but the core remained unchanged. The fear of hidden identity, the discomfort of intimacy without certainty. Listening to the story at night, it is easy to feel its pull. The room is familiar, the shadows are known, and yet something feels slightly off. The imagination stretches, just like the neck in the story, exploring possibilities that daylight dismisses. In this way, the Rokurokubi is not just a monster. It is a reminder that trust is always an act of faith, that knowing someone completely is an illusion, and that fear often lives not in what is unknown, but in what we think we know. As sleep approaches, the story does not demand vigilance. It invites acceptance, the understanding that uncertainty is part of connection, that vulnerability is unavoidable, and that sometimes the most unsettling truths reveal themselves only when the world grows quiet and the mind begins to wander beyond its usual limits. Fear changes its shape with time. As streets grow brighter and cities louder, the old spirits do not always disappear. They learn how to walk among crowds. The story of Kukase Kana belongs to this quieter, more modern unease. Born not in forests or temples, but on sidewalks near schools, beneath streetlights that flicker just enough to leave doubt behind. She appears as an ordinary woman at first, a coat pulled tight, a mask covering her face. In Japan, this detail matters. Masks are common, worn for illness, courtesy, anonymity. Nothing about her presence feels immediately threatening. That is where the story begins its work. Fear does not announce itself. It waits until recognition is too late. Her question is simple, almost polite. Am I beautiful? It is the kind of question that demands more than a factual answer. It asks for judgment, reassurance, honesty, and tact all at once. To answer carelessly is to risk offense. To hesitate is to reveal uncertainty. The listener is placed in an impossible position, mirroring the unease of social interaction itself. If the answer is yes, she removes her mask, revealing a mouth split grotesquely from ear to ear. If the answer is no, the punishment is immediate. In some versions, no answer is safe. Clever responses may delay her. Quick thinking may offer escape, but certainty never does. This is fear woven into etiquette, violence hiding behind politeness. Unlike ancient spirits tied to specific wrongs, Kukase Kana feels detached from personal history. Her origin stories vary, jealousy, abuse, betrayal, but none are definitive. This ambiguity allows her to move freely through time. She is not bound to one injustice. She is bound to collective anxiety. Her rise in popularity coincided with periods of social stress. urbanization, post-war trauma, shifts in gender expectations. Public spaces grew crowded, yet isolating. People learned to keep distance even when standing close. Kukase Kana thrives in this environment. She confronts strangers, forcing interaction where avoidance is preferred. There is also a deeper discomfort in her appearance. The disfigured mouth transforms speech into threat. Words become dangerous. Beauty becomes a trap. This reflects anxiety around appearance and judgment, especially for women. The pressure to be pleasing, the consequences of being seen, the violence that can follow unwanted attention. The story does not explain these themes outright. It lets them linger beneath the surface. Children's reactions to Kukase Kana are especially telling. The story spread rapidly among schoolyards. Whispered warnings passed from friend to friend. Adults dismissed it as rumor, yet altered routines nonetheless. Schools closed early. Patrols increased. The fear was irrational, but its effects were real. This is how urban legends function, not by proving themselves true, but by shaping behavior. What makes Kukase Kana particularly unsettling is her adaptability. She does not belong to the past. She walks modern streets. She wears contemporary clothes. She blends into crowds. Unlike Yurei bound to rituals or yokai tied to objects, she exists wherever people gather and strangers meet. She is portable fear. Her story also introduces the idea that survival depends on social intelligence rather than strength. Knowledge of the legend offers strategies. Offer candy. Distract her. Give a vague answer. This transforms fear into a puzzle. Engage in the mind even as it unsettles. It is no longer about escape alone, but about navigating conversation under pressure. At night, when streets empty and footsteps echo, her presence feels closer. Streetlights cast long shadows. Reflections appear in glass. A masked figure does not stand out. It blends in. The story teaches awareness, not paranoia. Notice your surroundings. Trust your instincts. But also recognize that danger does not always look dangerous. Over time, Kukase Kana became a symbol of how fear evolves. She represents a shift from communal, ritualized fear to individualized, sudden encounters. From shared stories told by firelight to whispered warnings exchanged quickly before dismissal. Her legend spreads not through tradition, but through rumor. Listening to her story before sleep, the fear does not spike. It settles. It becomes contemplative. The question she asks lingers, not as threat, but as reflection. How do we respond when confronted unexpectedly? How do we balance honesty and safety? How often do we answer automatically without awareness? In this way, Kukase Kana is less a monster and more a mirror. She reveals the vulnerabilities of modern life, the isolation within crowds, the tension of social performance, the fear of being seen incorrectly. She walks the line between myth and reality so closely that it becomes difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. As the night deepens and the world grows quieter, her footsteps fade into memory. But the unease remains, not sharp, but dull and persistent. A reminder that fear does not need ancient origins to feel real. It only needs the right moment, the right question, and the silence that follows before an answer is given. Some places seem to remember. Even after people leave, after buildings crumble or paths grow over, something lingers in the air, an impression that does not fade with time. In Japan, haunted places are rarely defined by spectacle. They are defined by atmosphere. A bridge where footsteps slow without reason. A forest path where conversation dies out naturally. An abandoned structure that feels heavier inside than it should. These are not places that scream danger. They whisper it. The belief that locations can absorb human emotion is deeply rooted. Tragedy, when intense enough, was thought to stain the land itself. Joy might pass through lightly, but suffering settles. When deaths were sudden, violent, or unjust, the emotional residue was believed to cling to its surroundings. Over time, these places developed reputations, not because something was always seen, but because something was always felt. Bridges appear often in these stories. They are natural thresholds, connecting one side to another, one state to the next. In folklore, thresholds are vulnerable places where transitions occur and balance can falter. A bridge where someone took their last step becomes more than a structure. It becomes a pause in the world, a place where movement hesitates. Even centuries later, people report a tightening in the chest when crossing, a reluctance to linger. Forests carry a different weight. They are quiet in a way that feels intentional. Sound behaves differently there. Light filters unevenly. In Japanese belief, forests were never empty. They were inhabited by unseen presences, some benevolent, some indifferent, when tragedy occurred within them. The natural silence took on a sharper edge. Stories describe voices calling from between trees, or paths that seemed to shift subtly, guiding travelers away from where they meant to go. Abandoned buildings are perhaps the most unsettling, because they once held life. Laughter, arguments, footsteps, routine. When these places fall silent, the absence feels unnatural. Rooms remember their purpose. Hallways hold echoes. In haunted folklore, these structures do not host ghosts actively roaming. Instead, they replay fragments. Doors closing, shadows moving, sensations of being watched. The haunting feels less like an invasion and more like a replay. What ties these locations together is not the appearance of spirits, but emotional dissonance. Something does not align. The mind senses it before the body understands. The subtlety is key. Japanese haunted places rarely rely on visual horror. They rely on intuition. The feeling that staying too long would be a mistake. Historically, these reputations shape behavior. Paths were rerouted. Shrines were built nearby, not to eliminate the presence, but to acknowledge it. Offerings were made. Prayers spoken. The goal was coexistence, not erasure. A haunted place was not always considered dangerous. It was considered sensitive, a place requiring respect. This approach reflects a broader cultural comfort with the idea that not all problems can be solved directly. Some must be managed gently. Avoidance was not cowardice, but wisdom. If a place carried sorrow, there was no need to challenge it. Time and distance were allowed to do their work. As stories spread, these locations became layered with narrative. One tragedy led to another. A single death multiplied through retelling. Over generations, fact and folklore blended. What mattered was not accuracy, but consistency of feeling. If many people felt unease in the same place, that unease became truth enough. Modernity did not erase these beliefs. It complicated them. Cities expanded over old sites. Roads crossed former burial grounds. Buildings rose where rivers once flowed. The past was paved over, but not forgotten. Reports of unease persisted, now framed through rumor rather than ritual. This created a new kind of haunting, not isolated, but embedded. A train station where accidents occur repeatedly. An apartment complex with unusually high turnover. These places are not officially labeled haunted, yet people speak of them carefully. Stories circulate quietly. Rent is lower. Stays are shorter. The behavior adapts even when belief is denied. Psychologically, this makes sense. Humans are pattern-seeking. When tragedy clusters, meaning is assigned. But folklore suggests something more, that places, like people, accumulate experience. That memory is not confined to minds alone. At night, these ideas become more potent. Darkness reduces detail. The imagination fills gaps. A rustle becomes significant. A shadow becomes intentional. In haunted places, this effect intensifies. The environment collaborates with the mind, amplifying unease without effort. Yet there is also a strange comfort in these locations. They offer a sense of continuity. They remind us that the past is not erased by time alone, that lives leave marks. In a rapidly changing world, haunted places resist erasure. They insist on remembrance. Some people are drawn to them, not out of thrill-seeking, but out of curiosity or empathy. To stand where something significant happened feels like acknowledgement, a silent witnessing. This impulse mirrors the rituals of old, recognizing pain rather than denying it. In this way, haunted places become emotional landmarks. They map where sorrow once overflowed. They serve as warnings, memorials, and reminders all at once. They do not ask to be feared. They ask to be noticed. As the night deepens and sleep approaches, thoughts of these places settle gently. They do not intrude. They linger like half-remembered dreams. The idea that the world holds memory beyond what we can see becomes less unsettling, more poetic. If places can remember, then nothing truly disappears. Every step leaves an impression. Every moment of intense emotion shapes the space it inhabits. Haunted places, in this sense, are not failures of the world to move on. They are evidence that it does not forget easily. And perhaps that is why they continue to draw quiet attention. Not because they are dangerous, but because they feel honest. They remind us that history is not always recorded in books. Sometimes it is etched into the air, waiting patiently for someone to pause, listen, and feel what remains. There are places where sound seems to retreat, where even the wind lowers its voice. Aokigahara is often described this way, not because it is empty, but because it feels inward-facing, as though the forest itself is listening rather than speaking. Dense trees press close together, their roots twisting across volcanic rock, creating a landscape that feels older than memory. Light filters in unevenly, soft and muted, as if daylight itself hesitates before entering. From the first step inside, the world beyond begins to feel distant. Long before modern associations shaped its reputation, this forest existed as a place of stories. Lava hardened here centuries ago, leaving the ground uneven, porous, and difficult to navigate. Compasses behaved strangely. Footsteps sounded different. Paths curved subtly, encouraging disorientation. In a country deeply attentive to natural signs, these qualities alone were enough to invite myth. Places that confused the senses were never considered neutral. They were liminal, neither fully welcoming nor openly hostile. Early folklore spoke of spirits inhabiting deep forests, not necessarily malicious, but detached from human concerns. These were places where travelers could lose themselves not only physically, but emotionally. In such environments, unresolved thoughts grow louder. Memories surface without warning. The forest does not impose feelings, but removes distractions, allowing what is already present to rise. Over time, Aokigahara became linked with sorrow, not because it caused despair, but because it attracted it. In moments of overwhelming emotional weight, people have always sought places that mirror their inner silence. The forest stillness offered that reflection. This association grew gradually, shaped by individual stories rather than a single origin. Each story layered upon the last, thickening the emotional atmosphere much like the trees thicken the canopy. It is important to approach this subject with care, because the forest is often reduced to a single narrative. In reality, it holds many. It is a place of hiking trails, bird calls, and seasonal change. Snow settles there in winter. Leaves turn gold in autumn. Life persists quietly. To see it only through the lens of tragedy is to miss its complexity. Yet the weight cannot be denied. Those who are in a forest often speak of an immediate emotional shift. Not fear exactly, but heaviness. A sense of being observed, not by something external, but by one's own thoughts. The silence becomes a mirror. In a culture that values endurance and restraint, spaces where emotion can no longer be suppressed carry a particular significance. Japanese folklore has long recognized silence as powerful. Silence is not absence. It is presence without articulation. In haunted narratives, silence often precedes revelation. In Aokigahara, silence becomes the story itself. There are no dramatic apparitions described in traditional accounts. No sudden screams. Only the feeling that something unfinished lingers, unresolved and tender. The spirits associated with the forest are not vengeful. They are described as lost, confused, or sorrowful. This distinction matters. Fear gives way to compassion. The haunting is not about danger, but about weight. The forest does not trap. It holds. Historically, communities responded to such places not with denial, but with ritual. Markers were placed. Paths were defined. Stories were told carefully. The goal was not to erase the forest's reputation, but to guide behavior within it. Awareness was protection. Respect was balance. In modern times, these practices evolved. Signs appeared, offering words of care and encouragement. Patrols walked quietly. Efforts focused not on spectacle, but on presence. The response recognized that what draws people to such places is not curiosity, but pain. And pain requires gentleness. At night, Thinking about Aokigahara evokes a particular stillness, not the sharp fear of ghost stories, but a deep, contemplative quiet. It invites reflection on how environments shape emotion and how humans seek spaces that resonate with their inner state. The forest becomes less a symbol of death and more a symbol of pause, a place where everything slows. This reframing is important. To speak of the forest only as haunted is to overlook the humanity woven into its story. It is haunted not by monsters, but by echoes of feeling, by moments when individuals felt unseen, unheard, or overwhelmed. The forest absorbed those moments, not out of malice, but because it was there. Listening to the story before sleep, the mind does not race. It settles. There is sadness, yes, but also empathy. The understanding that places can hold emotion just as people do. That landscapes are not blank backdrops, but participants in human experience. In Japanese storytelling, such places are rarely condemned. They are approached with caution, humility, and care. The forest is not something to conquer or sensationalize. It is something to acknowledge quietly. As the night deepens, the image of Aokigahara softens. The darkness between trees becomes less threatening, more introspective. The silence becomes a reminder of the importance of listening, to oneself, to others, to unspoken struggles. If there's a lesson held within the forest, it is not one of fear. It is one of attention. That when pain is ignored, it seeks quiet places to rest. And that when compassion is offered, through presence, through care, through remembrance, the weight can be shared. In this way, Aokigahara stands not as a warning, but as a mirror, reflecting the human need for understanding, reflecting the consequences of silence without support, and reflecting the possibility that even the heaviest places can be approached with respect rather than dread. As sleep approaches, the forest remains still, not calling, not pushing, simply existing. A reminder that the world holds spaces of deep quiet, and that within that quiet, there is both sorrow and potential for gentleness. Beyond villages and cities, beyond paths worn smooth by countless feet, Japan's mountains and seas have always watched quietly. They are older than human memory, shaped by forces that do not explain themselves. Long before ghost stories took form around hearths and lanterns, people looked to these vast landscapes with a mixture of reverence and unease. Nature was never considered empty. It was aware, and in that awareness, spirits were believed to dwell. Mountains, in particular, carried immense spiritual weight. Their peaks disappeared into clouds, unreachable and unknowable. Weather shifted without warning. A clear morning could dissolve into mist by noon. To live near mountains was to accept unpredictability as a constant companion. It felt natural to imagine that something lived within them. Presences that were not hostile, but not human either. Spirits of the mountains were often described as guardians rather than monsters. They watched over forests, animals, and travelers alike. But guardianship did not mean gentleness. Those who showed respect, offering prayers, moving carefully, acknowledging boundaries, were often protected. Those who acted with arrogance or carelessness faced misfortune. In this way, mountain spirits reinforce a moral relationship with the land. Survival depended on humility. The sea held a similar duality. It fed communities, carried boats, and connected islands, yet it could turn violent without warning. Fishermen understood this intimately. A calm surface could hide dangerous currents. Storms rose quickly. Lives were lost in moments. Over time, the sea became personified, its moods explained through spirits who ruled beneath the waves. Sea spirits were not always vengeful. Many were believed to guide ships, ward storms, or carry souls to the afterlife. The ocean became a threshold, much like bridges or forests, a place where transitions occurred. Those who drowned were thought not simply lost, but taken into a different realm, watched over by beings who understood the sea's rhythms. What unites these beliefs is the idea that nature responds, not emotionally, but relationally. Actions have consequences. Noise disrupts. Greed invites loss. Balance must be maintained. These stories did not frame nature as something to dominate, but something to negotiate with. Respect was not symbolic. It was practical. Rivers, too, carried spirits. Flowing water was seen as movement between states. constantly changing yet always present. To cross a river was to cross a boundary. Many tales speak of spirits appearing near water at dusk, moments when light and dark overlap. The sound of flowing water masked footsteps, creating uncertainty. The mind filled gaps with presence. In these stories, nature spirits were rarely depicted with fixed forms. They appeared as shadows, voices, or sensations rather than figures. A sudden chill, a feeling of being watched, a shift in wind. This lack of clear shape made them more pervasive. They could be anywhere at any time. Their presence was suggested, not declared. This subtlety is important. It mirrors how people experience nature itself. Awe does not arrive suddenly. It builds slowly. Standing before a mountain or staring out at open water evokes humility, a recognition of smallness. The folklore amplified this feeling, giving it narrative weight. At night, these landscapes transformed further. Mountains became silhouettes. The sea became a dark expanse, without edge. Sound traveled differently. A splash echoed longer than expected. A falling rock sounded deliberate. In darkness, the idea that something unseen shared the space felt reasonable, even comforting. It meant one was not alone. These beliefs shaped daily behavior. Fishermen offered prayers before setting out. Travelers bowed to mountains before crossing passes. Shrines were built at natural thresholds, not to confine spirits, but to acknowledge them. The physical act of stopping, bowing, offering created a moment of mindfulness. It reminded people that they were entering a space not entirely their own. As time passed, these stories were woven into myths, songs, and local legends. Each region developed its own variations. A mountain spirit here was playful. Another there was stern. A sea spirit in one village guided lost boats. In another, it demanded offerings. The diversity reflected the landscapes themselves. No two mountains are the same. No two coastlines behave identically. Modern life altered these relationships, but did not erase them. Roads cut through mountains. Ships grew larger. Technology promised control. Yet accidents still happened. Storms still overwhelmed forecasts. People still spoke quietly of places where misfortune clustered. The old language adapted, but the feeling remained. In sleep-focused storytelling, these nature spirits carry a calming weight. They do not jump or shout. They loom gently. They remind listeners of vastness, of time beyond human schedules. The mind, tired from managing daily concerns, finds relief in imagining forces that move slowly and deliberately. There's also reassurance in the idea that nature watches back, that the world is not indifferent, that actions matter beyond immediate consequence. This belief can be grounding rather than frightening. It suggests a universe that responds, even if it does not speak. As the night deepens, thoughts of mountains and seas drift in like distant memories. The sound of waves becomes rhythmic. The outline of peaks fades into darkness. The presence of spirits within these spaces feels less like intrusion and more like companionship. Silent, ancient, steady. In the end, these stories are not warnings meant to instill fear. They are reminders of relationship. Humans do not exist apart from the world around them. They move through spaces shaped by forces older and larger than themselves. To acknowledge that is not to surrender. It is to listen. As sleep approaches, the idea settles gently, that somewhere beyond walls and roads, mountains stand unmoved, seas breathe in and out endlessly, and within them, unseen presences keep watch, not with judgment, but with the quiet patience of things that have always been there, long before stories were told, and long after they fade into dreams. In Japan, as in many cultures, the stories told to children were never simply entertainment. They were lessons in caution, morality, and awareness, wrapped in the form of ghosts and supernatural beings. Unlike modern children's stories that often soften consequences or resolve conflict neatly, these tales were darker, more emotionally intense, and entirely unapologetic in their treatment of fear. The reasoning was practical as much as cultural. Childhood was understood as preparation for a world that would be unforgiving, where danger often arrived without warning. Children's exposure to darkness, spirits, and the unknown was framed as education. Fear was not gratuitous. It was functional. When a yokai appeared on a forest path, or when a vengeful spirit lingered near a bridge, children learned to pay attention to their surroundings. They learned that every action had consequence. They learned caution, both physical and emotional. The stories acted as early guides in navigating a world in which safety was never guaranteed, and the invisible forces of nature and human behavior carried weight that could not be ignored. Some of the most enduring children's stories centered on moral failings. Disobedience, greed, vanity, and cruelty were punished by the supernatural. A child who lied might be taken by a spirit that waited silently in a shadowed corner. One who ignored a parent warning could fall prey to creatures that mirrored the consequences of carelessness. In this way, folklore served as a behavioral guide. It framed morality in tangible terms. Unseen forces would respond to actions, and maintaining respect, honesty, and awareness was essential. But these stories did not exist in a vacuum. They reflected the social and cultural context in which children grew up. Communities were tight-knit, resources were scarce, and survival depended on attentiveness, cooperation, and respect for a hierarchy. Children were expected to learn responsibility early. Ghost stories and tales of supernatural beings acted as extensions of these social expectations, offering memorable narratives that reinforced lessons without the need for constant supervision. The emotional intensity of these stories was deliberate. Children were not shielded from the darker sides of existence, because darkness itself was unavoidable. Death, suffering, and misfortune were real and ever-present in historical Japan. Epidemics, natural disasters, accidents, and sudden illness were common. Shielding children from fear would not prepare them for these realities. Instead, folklore introduced these concepts in controlled ways, allowing children to process fear safely through narrative. A notable aspect of these stories is the way they balance terror and empathy. Children were encouraged to recognize both the danger and the reason behind it. A yokai punishes because of behavior, not arbitrary cruelty. A vengeful spirit lingers because injustice was done. By framing fear within moral and emotional logic, children learn to analyze situations and understand the consequences of human actions, not just to react with panic. These stories also emphasize attentiveness to the environment. Forests, rivers, bridges, and mountains were not merely settings. They were active participants in the narrative. A child walking alone was cautioned to respect the land and remain vigilant. Objects, animals, and natural phenomena were often animated with spirits or forces, teaching that observation and mindfulness mattered. Even seemingly mundane elements of daily life could become sources of supernatural consequence, reinforcing awareness at every turn. Repetition and communal storytelling strengthened these lessons. Ghost stories were not read silently from books but shared orally, often at gatherings or during long evenings. The ritual of listening, reacting, and discussing the narrative allowed children to internalize lessons slowly, integrating fear into a broader understanding of how to navigate their world. Storytelling became a shared experience, reinforcing communal norms and expectations alongside cautionary content. Interestingly, these tales also allowed children to confront complex emotions. Fear, curiosity, empathy, and guilt could be explored safely within the framework of narrative. A child might imagine the suffering of a wronged spirit or consider the consequences of disobedience without experiencing actual harm. This emotional rehearsal provided early training in emotional intelligence, preparing young minds to recognize subtle social cues and moral dilemmas in real life. The dark tone of these stories did not preclude wonder. Many tales blended the frightening with the fantastical, introducing children to the beauty and mystery of the world alongside its dangers. Spirits could be terrifying, but they could also be majestic, playful, or enigmatic. Nature was both awe-inspiring and potentially lethal. This duality fostered respect for the unknown rather than blind fear, teaching that curiosity and caution must coexist. Moreover, the use of supernatural figures in children's stories reinforced the idea that actions have consequences beyond immediate perception. A child might never encounter yokai, but the possibility that unseen forces are observing behavior encourages attentiveness and accountability. The lesson is clear. The moral and natural order extends beyond what is visible, and mindfulness is essential to harmony. These narratives were carefully crafted to linger in memory. Vivid imagery, Repetitive phrasing and emotionally charged scenarios ensured that lessons would be recalled long after the story ended. Fear became a tool for retention. A child who remembered the terrifying consequences of greed or disobedience was more likely to internalize the principle behind it. In this way, horror and morality were inseparable. The cultural persistence of these stories speaks to their effectiveness. Even as modern education and entertainment evolve, traditional ghost stories continue to circulate among children, adapted into books, theater, and media. The underlying purpose remained: to instill awareness, respect, and emotional resilience. The stories taught that the world was neither completely safe nor entirely predictable, and that readiness, empathy, and careful observation were necessary for survival and social harmony. Finally, these stories encourage imagination. Children learn to visualize unseen forces, interpret subtle signs, and anticipate consequences. This cognitive exercise extended beyond fear, fostering creative problem-solving and narrative thinking. The mind practiced navigating scenarios where rules were unfamiliar, outcomes uncertain, and perception critical, a skill that would prove useful both socially and practically as they grew older. By exposing children to fear, these tales accomplished multiple goals simultaneously. They educated morally, emotionally, socially, and cognitively. They created a shared cultural framework in which the unknown could be explored safely. They reinforced social norms and expectations while offering space for personal reflection and imagination. In a culture that understood life as unpredictable and often perilous, children's exposure to these darker stories was not cruel, but pragmatic. In this way, the darkness of Japanese folklore for children is not emptiness or chaos. It is a carefully constructed space for learning, reflection, and preparation. Fear is not simply the absence of safety. It is a guide, a teacher that instructs not through explanation, but through experience and imagination. It trains attention, nurtures empathy, and reinforces the subtle awareness necessary to navigate both the visible and invisible worlds. It teaches that understanding, respect, and caution are as essential as bravery, and that the lessons learned in the quiet of storytelling will follow far beyond childhood into every step of life. During the Edo period, roughly spanning the 17th to 19th centuries, Japan underwent a transformation that affected not only its cities and culture, but also the very way fear and storytelling were experienced. This era was defined by relative peace, political stability, and economic growth. Yet it was also an era of confinement, dense urban populations, and intense social observation. Within this unique environment, ghost stories and tales of the supernatural shifted from private, oral traditions to more public and performative forms, turning fear into entertainment while maintaining its moral and emotional undercurrents. In earlier periods, haunted stories were often tied directly to personal experience or localized tragedy. A vengeful spirit might arise from injustice, an accident, or betrayal that touched a single village or household. These stories were shared quietly, passed down from elders to children or among neighbors, often at night or during long winters. The horror was personal, intimate, and tied to observation of cause and consequence. By the Edo period, however, urban life created new audiences and new opportunities for storytelling. Cities like Edo, modern Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka had expanded dramatically, housing hundreds of thousands of people living in close quarters. Streets were bustling, yet personal privacy was limited. Houses were small and wooden, often separated by narrow alleys. In this environment, the boundaries between homes and neighborhoods were porous, and stories spread quickly, fueled by curiosity and social gossip. This setting gave rise to organized forms of ghost storytelling, such as Keidankai or ghost story gatherings, which became a popular form of social entertainment. These were not casual whispers around the hearth. They were communal events, often held indoors with small groups, where participants would recount, embellish, or even dramatize tales of spirits, vengeful dead, and supernatural occurrences. Candles flickered, incense perfumed the air, and listeners leaned closer to catch every detail. The atmosphere was carefully crafted to maximize emotional impact without causing genuine panic. Silence, pacing, and suggestion were as important as the narrative itself. Storytellers understood that fear is most effective when it is hinted at, experienced gradually, and allowed to linger in the imagination. The Edo period also saw the proliferation of printed books and illustrated pamphlets, making ghost stories more widely accessible. Artists created woodblock prints depicting famous yokai, vengeful spirits, and dramatic scenes from popular tales. These images provided visual reinforcement to the oral narratives, embedding certain figures, like Oiwa or Yukiana, into collective consciousness. Repetition through both text and image strengthened recognition, making the stories feel familiar, while preserving their eerie allure. Visual cues helped listeners and readers understand the emotions behind the stories: sorrow, betrayal, longing, or quiet menace. Even those who had not heard the story firsthand could encounter its emotional resonance through illustration. Kaiden were carefully constructed to balance fear with social lessons. Edo period society emphasized hierarchy, duty, and moral conduct. Ghost stories reinforced these values. A vengeful spirit often punished someone for betrayal, cruelty, or neglect. A haunted place demanded respect. Listening to these tales reinforced the understanding that actions carried consequences, sometimes beyond human observation. For urban dwellers who lived under close scrutiny, the story served as both caution and entertainment. The supernatural became a mirror reflecting the social and emotional landscape of the city, highlighting tensions, obligations, and the consequences of moral failings in a world that was densely interconnected. The theatrical dimension of Edo Kaiden is significant. Storytellers understood timing, voice modulation, and the power of pauses. Fear was constructed not through spectacle, but through psychological engagement. The audience's imagination filled in gaps, often producing more vivid terror than explicit description could provide. Candles flickered shadows onto walls, footsteps creaked unexpectedly, and incense smoke drifted lazily through rooms, creating sensory layers that heightened immersion. Storytelling became a multidimensional experience, merging the auditory, visual, and emotional into a single, unforgettable performance. Interestingly, humor was sometimes woven into these narratives, particularly in tales involving yokai or trickster spirits. Edo audiences appreciated a blend of dread and amusement. A yokai might behave unpredictably, startling the listener momentarily before revealing itself as mischievous rather than lethal. This balance prevented overwhelming fear, allowing stories to remain suitable for repeated retelling, and reinforcing the Edo period's social preference for controlled, communal enjoyment. Fear became an experience to be shared, managed, and even celebrated. The urban environment itself also influenced the content of ghost stories. Narrow alleyways, crowded wooden homes, and shared walls created natural opportunities for suspense. A shadow glimpsed through a paper screen could suggest a spirit waiting patiently. The close proximity of neighbors meant that rumors and reports of haunted houses spread rapidly, giving a single tale a social dimension. People who had never seen a ghost personally still engaged with the story collectively, forming a culture of shared imagination. In a society where physical violence was limited under strict law, supernatural stories provided a socially safe outlet for tension, fear, and moral reflection. Another notable feature of Edo period ghost storytelling was the attention to emotional depth. Spirits were rarely mindless monsters. They were defined by human experiences: grief, betrayal, jealousy, or love. A vengeful spirit often retained traces of its humanity, emphasizing the consequences of emotional neglect or injustice. This psychological sophistication distinguished Edo Kaiden from mere horror. Audiences were drawn into a moral and emotional universe where fear was intertwined with empathy. Understanding the source of a spirit's unrest became as compelling as the suspense itself. The popularity of Kaiden also reinforced ritual behavior. Listeners would sometimes perform small gestures of acknowledgement or respect, bowing briefly, offering a word of caution, or pausing in silence, reflecting the cultural principle that recognition and attention could influence the unseen world. Storytelling, then, was not only entertainment, it was a rehearsal of moral and spiritual awareness. Children and adults alike learned to navigate fear in ways that were socially meaningful and emotionally instructive. Even after the Edo period, these storytelling traditions influenced literature, theater, and later media. Kabuki and bunraku theaters incorporated Kaiden into their performances, bringing ghosts and supernatural beings to life on stage. The Edo approach to suspense, gradual build-up, moral grounding, and emotional resonance, remained influential. The legacy of careful pacing, attention to psychological tension, and integration of moral lessons into fear persists in modern Japanese horror and folklore adaptations. In contemplating the Edo period's role in shaping ghost stories, it is clear that the urban and social environment was as important as the supernatural content itself. Cities created audiences, communal engagement, and narrative reinforcement. The densification of life amplified the stakes of moral behavior, making stories of spirits both relevant and emotionally compelling. The transition from private, oral tales to public, performative experiences demonstrates the adaptability of folklore, showing how cultural context shapes not just content, but the very form and impact of stories. For listeners today, understanding Edo period storytelling provides insight into why Japanese ghost narratives maintain such enduring resonance. The combination of suspense, morality, psychological depth, and performative skill creates stories that are immersive, memorable, and emotionally engaging. They are designed not to shock indiscriminately, but to evoke reflection, empathy, and awareness. The Edo period demonstrates that horror and education, fear and entertainment can coexist harmoniously, producing stories that linger in memory and imagination long after they are told. In the quiet hours, reflecting on these narratives, one can almost hear the soft shuffle of footsteps in Edo alleyways, the flicker of candlelight casting shadows, the hush of listeners leaning forward in anticipation. Fear is present but controlled. Suspense is real but socially structured. The Edo period shows that ghost stories need not rely solely on grotesque or the violent to endure. They can persist through atmosphere, empathy, and the subtle artistry of communal engagement. It is this careful balance that allowed ghost stories to flourish as entertainment, moral guidance, and cultural practice, leaving a legacy that continues to shape Japanese folklore and storytelling today. The Edo period laid the groundwork for a unique and enduring form of ghost storytelling, but it was a development performance art and, later, cinema that allowed these tales to reach their full expressive potential. Theater in Japan, particularly kabuki and bunraku, transformed supernatural stories from private narrative experiences into collective, performative spectacles. In these spaces, ghosts, spirits, and supernatural beings were not merely recounted. They were embodied, given voice, movement, and visual presence in a way that reinforced both the fear and emotional resonance of the original folklore. This transition from oral storytelling to stage performance marked a significant evolution, shaping how audiences would experience the supernatural for centuries to come. Kabuki theater, emerging prominently in the 17th century, combined music, dance, and dramatic performance to create highly stylized storytelling. The use of exaggerated gestures, slow deliberate movements, and vocal modulation allowed actors to convey not just narrative, but emotion and psychological depth. When ghost stories were adapted for kabuki, the goal was not merely to frighten, but to immerse audiences in the moral and emotional stakes of the tale. A vengeful spirit like Oiwa or a sorrowful Yurei could dominate the stage through posture, gaze, and costume alone, conveying both their anguish and their supernatural power without a word being spoken. Audiences were trained to respond to these subtle cues, allowing fear, tension, and empathy to build gradually. Costumes and makeup in kabuki were essential tools for depicting ghosts and supernatural beings. The iconic white burial robes, the pale makeup, and the unbound hair were borrowed directly from folklore, but they were enhanced for dramatic effect. The visual language of these performances emphasized the liminality of spirits. They were human yet otherworldly, familiar yet unsettling. By exaggerating features or using movement that defied ordinary human anatomy, floating steps, gliding motions, slow, deliberate gestures, actors embodied the emotional weight of the spirit's past life, its unresolved grief, or its quest for justice. Audiences were drawn into a dual experience: the narrative of the story and the emotional reality of the spirit, both unfolding simultaneously in the same performance space. Bunraku puppet theater added another layer of expressive potential. Puppeteers could manipulate the body of a spirit in ways human actors could not, elongating limbs, rotating heads unnaturally, or freezing motion to emphasize suspense. Combined with narrated dialogue and shamisen music, Bunraku created a fully immersive experience in which the emotional and supernatural dimensions of folklore were amplified. Ghosts in Bunraku were not static representations. They moved with narrative purpose, reacting to human characters, interacting with the environment, and conveying a sense of presence that blurred the line between story and reality. The audience was not merely watching. They were participating emotionally, sensing the grief, anger, or longing of the spirits as if these feelings extended beyond the stage. Visual art also played a significant role in shaping perceptions of ghosts and spirits. Ukiyo-e prints depicted dramatic scenes from kabuki plays and folklore, spreading the imagery of iconic spirits like Yukiana, Oiwa, or Rokuro Kubi beyond the theater. These images captured the essence of the characters, emphasizing emotional expression, posture, and context. The combination of theater and visual representation reinforced the cultural understanding of ghosts. They were not abstract, terrifying anomalies, but entities defined by their human experiences, moral histories, and unresolved emotions. This consistency allowed audiences, even those who could not attend performances, to recognize the figures and emotional stakes instantly. The transition from stage to early cinema in the late 19th and early 20th centuries continued this evolution. Silent films in Japan often drew directly from kabuki adaptations, using theatrical techniques to convey mood, tension, and supernatural presence. The absence of spoken dialogue placed further emphasis on visual storytelling. Lighting, shadows, camera angles, and movement became tools for suspense. Audiences experienced fear and empathy simultaneously, witnessing not only what the spirit did, but why it existed, and what emotional weight it carried from its human life. The visual vocabulary of kabuki, gliding movement, dramatic costumes, and exaggerated expression, was adapted for film, maintaining continuity, while exploiting the unique capabilities of the medium. One key innovation in early Japanese cinema was the use of suggestion over explicit depiction. Filmmakers learned from traditional storytelling that the unseen can be more potent than the visible. Shadows falling in hallways, reflections in mirrors, flickering candlelight. These subtle techniques created suspense and allowed the audience's imagination to fill the gaps. The approach mirrored Edo period Keidan gatherings, where tension was built through pacing, silence, and audience expectation rather than overt action. This restraint heightened emotional engagement, making the audience complicit in the narrative and in the moral universe of the ghost story. Throughout these developments, a consistent theme emerges. Japanese ghosts and spirits are deeply human, even in their supernatural state. Vengeful spirits punish betrayal. Grief-stricken yurei linger near loved ones, and playful or mischievous yokai challenge inattentive humans. The power of these stories lies not in gratuitous horror, but in the amplification of human emotion. Theater and film serve as vehicles for empathy, allowing audiences to experience fear, sorrow, and moral reflection in ways that are immediate and embodied. A ghost is terrifying precisely because it is recognizably human, yet unbound by the limitations that govern the living. This emotional depth distinguishes Japanese supernatural narratives from many Western horror traditions, where monsters often exist outside of human morality. In Japanese theater and film, even the most malevolent spirit has a backstory, a reason for its presence, and emotional weight that informs its actions. The audience is invited to understand and, in some cases, sympathize with the spirit. This narrative complexity enriches the storytelling, allowing horror and empathy to coexist in a delicate balance. Kabuki, bunraku, and cinema also demonstrate the importance of space and audience engagement in Japanese ghost storytelling. The architecture of theaters, the arrangement of stages, the proximity of the audience, all contributed to how fear and emotion were experienced. Theatrical conventions, such as a hanamichi in kabuki, a walkway extending into the audience, allowed spirits to appear closer to viewers, bridging the gap between story and spectator. Similarly, early cinema employed tight framing, careful use of depth, and strategic camera movement to replicate this intimacy, maintaining the psychological tension cultivated over centuries of oral and performative tradition. Music and sound, though often subtle, also enhance the emotional impact. The shamisen in bunraku, the rhythmic footwork and vocal modulation in kabuki, and later the use of atmospheric scores in cinema reinforce the narrative rhythm. Silence itself became a tool. Pauses allowed tension to accumulate, while carefully timed cues signaled shifts in mood or impending revelation. These techniques mirror the human experience of fear. Anticipation often heightens emotion more effectively than immediate action. In Japanese supernatural storytelling, the interplay between action, suggestion, and audience expectation is meticulously orchestrated to evoke maximum psychological impact. As the 20th century progressed, Filmmakers continue to draw inspiration from traditional theater and folklore while experimenting with new technologies. Lighting techniques emphasize shadows, reflections, and silhouettes. Cinematography allowed the manipulation of scale, perspective, and movement in ways impossible on stage. Editing rhythms could accelerate or slow tension, building suspense that resonated with the psychological strategies developed over centuries of storytelling. Despite these innovations, the core principles remained. Spirits are emotionally grounded, morality informs behavior, and fear is mediated through suggestion, empathy, and recognition of human vulnerability. The enduring influence of kabuki and early cinema is evident in contemporary Japanese horror. Modern films often return to traditional motifs: the long-haired yurei, the gliding figure, the morally consequential haunting. Directors and storytellers continue to emphasize psychological tension, subtle suggestion, and emotional histories of supernatural beings. The lineage from Edo period Kaiden, through theatrical adaptation, to cinematic expression underscores a cultural continuity. Japanese ghost stories are designed not merely to frighten, but to immerse the audience in moral, emotional, and psychological landscapes that reflect the human condition. What makes these developments remarkable is the way each medium preserves and amplifies the original intentions of folklore. Oral storytelling taught attention, empathy, and moral reflection. Kabuki and bunraku embodied these lessons physically and visually, offering communal, immersive experiences. Early cinema translated these techniques into a new visual language, allowing broader audiences to experience the interplay of fear, morality, and emotion. Each adaptation reinforced the same core message: ghosts are not arbitrary horrors. They are manifestations of human experience, moral consequence, and emotional resonance. Even today, the legacy of theater and film shapes how Japanese ghosts are understood and experienced. Visual motifs, pacing, and psychological strategies rooted in kabuki and bunraku continue to inform storytelling, whether in traditional performances, films, animation, or literature. The haunting presence of spirits remains deeply human, morally grounded, and emotionally potent. They endure because they are familiar, yet unpredictable, intimate, yet beyond control. They invite empathy while evoking fear, sustaining the delicate tension that has defined Japanese supernatural storytelling for centuries. Ultimately, the evolution of ghost stories from oral tales to theater and cinema illustrates the adaptability of folklore. The narratives are preserved not only through their content, but through their method of presentation, their rhythm, their visual and auditory cues, and their engagement with audience psychology. By embodying spirits on stage and screen, performers and filmmakers extend the lessons of folklore beyond mere imagination, making emotion, morality, and fear tangible. Audiences do not merely witness these stories, they inhabit them. They experience the grief, longing, vengeance, or sorrow of the supernatural as if it were their own, creating a form of narrative intimacy that is rare in global folklore. Through this continuous evolution, Japanese ghost stories have maintained their relevance, intensity, and emotional depth. Whether whispered by candlelight, performed on stage, or projected on film, the spirits remain true to their origins. Human at their core, morally and emotionally charged, and capable of evoking a profound blend of fear, empathy, and reflection. The development of theater and cinema did not dilute these stories. It amplified their resonance, transforming folklore into immersive experiences that continue to captivate, haunt, and instruct audiences centuries after they were first imagined. Japanese ghost stories are often misunderstood outside of their cultural context. To an outsider, they may appear purely terrifying, focus on sudden shocks or grotesque imagery. In reality, Japanese horror is deeply psychological, rooted not in spectacle, but in the exploration of emotional and moral consequences. The fear it evokes is subtle, slow-growing, and deeply reflective, arising as much from the human mind as from the supernatural. Understanding why Japanese horror feels different requires examining its foundations in folklore, theater, literature, and social consciousness, as well as its intricate relationship with the human psyche. At the heart of Japanese supernatural storytelling is the concept of lingering emotions. Spirits and ghosts are rarely malevolent without reason. They emerge from unresolved grief, injustice, betrayal, or profound sorrow. The most iconic examples, such as the vengeful Oiwo or the snowbound Yukiana, are terrifying not because of brute force, but because of the intense human experiences that gave rise to them. This approach positions fear as a mirror of human experience. It is psychological, relational, and moral. The audience is invited to empathize even as they are unsettled, creating a dual experience of dread and reflection that differs significantly from Western horror traditions, which often prioritize externalized monsters and immediate physical threat. The pacing of Japanese horror is another distinctive feature. Rather than rapid escalation, tension is built gradually, layer by layer. Edo period Kaiden exemplified this. Storytellers will describe mundane scenes first, establishing normalcy, before hinting at subtle anomalies, a creaking door, an odd shadow, a silence that seems heavier than it should be. The mind begins to question its environment, filling gaps with imagination, long before any explicit horror is revealed. This slow accumulation of unease mirrors the real-world experience of anxiety. It is not always sudden or obvious, but a creeping awareness that something is amiss. Modern Japanese horror retains this pacing, using lingering shots, ambient sound, and deliberate silences to draw audiences into a psychological state where tension grows in tandem with empathy and curiosity. Atmosphere is central to the construction of fear. Settings are chosen to amplify emotional resonance. Abandoned houses, dense forests, quiet riversides, and dimly lit urban streets all serve as conduits for psychological tension. These spaces are not inherently threatening. Their danger emerges from their interplay with human perception. The natural and built environment is imbued with presence, memory, and moral weight. A forest is not merely a collection of trees. It is a liminal space where emotion, memory, and nature converge. A river does not merely flow. It carries echoes of lives lost or moments unresolved. By emphasizing atmosphere over spectacle, Japanese horror transforms ordinary environments into emotionally charged landscapes that heighten both suspense and empathy. Silence and suggestion play crucial roles in creating fear. Where Western horror often relies on jump scares or graphic imagery, Japanese storytelling leverages what is left unseen or unspoken. A flickering shadow, an unexplained sound, or a sudden absence of normal environmental noise can be more unsettling than any visible threat. The audience is forced to fill the void with their imagination, and in doing so, personal fears are projected into the story. This technique extends the power of the narrative beyond the storyteller's control. Fear becomes individualized, intimate, and persistent. The unknown is never fully resolved, leaving space for the audience's mind to explore, speculate, and anticipate, maintaining tension even in moments of narrative pause. Morality and consequence are deeply entwined with the experience of fear. In Japanese folklore, human behavior often dictates the emergence or intensity of supernatural events. Wrongdoing, neglect, betrayal, or cruelty can attract vengeful spirits. Acts of kindness, respect, or ritual acknowledgement can soothe unrest. This moral framework gives fear a purposeful dimension. It is not arbitrary, but a natural extension of ethical imbalance. Even modern horror maintains this principle, framing threats as responses to human failings rather than external, random evil. The audience is subtly encouraged to reflect on ethical behavior, creating a psychological engagement that extends beyond mere entertainment. Character design in Japanese horror is equally reflective of psychological nuance. The visual language of spirits, pale faces, unbound hair, elongated limbs, conveys emotional and symbolic meaning as much as literal threat. A pale, floating figure in a white burial kimono represents grief and unresolved mortality, while long, disheveled hair suggests disorder, neglect, or untethered emotion. These motifs are recognizable yet ambiguous, leaving room for interpretation and enhancing emotional investment. Unlike Western monsters, which are often clearly defined and externalized, Japanese spirits maintain a liminal quality. They straddle the boundary between human and otherworldly, familiar and uncanny, eliciting both fear and empathy. Sound design in Japanese horror complements visual and narrative strategies. Traditional storytelling, theater, and early cinema relied heavily on vocal modulation, ambient sound, and rhythm to heighten suspense. A creaking floorboard, a distant whisper, or the subtle rustle of a kimono could shift the emotional tenor of a scene dramatically. Silence, as much as noise, carries weight. Pauses are used strategically to allow tension to accumulate, forcing the audience to anticipate rather than react. Modern Japanese horror films continue this practice, layering environmental sound, music, and silence to create immersive psychological landscapes. Auditory cues are not just signals of danger, they are emotional amplifiers, shaping perception and expectation. Another defining aspect is ambiguity. Japanese horror often avoids clear resolutions. Spirits may linger, events may remain unexplained, and moral outcomes may be incomplete. This uncertainty prolongs engagement, keeping the audience mentally active even after the story ends. In contrast to Western narratives, which frequently provide closure through resolution or confrontation, Japanese stories embrace the incompleteness of human experience. Fear is sustained because the unknown persists. The supernatural is not fully controlled, explained, or eliminated. This ambiguity enhances realism, emphasizing that life, death, and emotion rarely conform to neat boundaries. Interpersonal relationships are frequently central to Japanese horror narratives. Rather than relying solely on external threats, the horror often arises from human connections, betrayal, jealousy, unspoken longing, or neglected responsibilities. Spirits and supernatural events act as extensions or consequences of these relationships. For example, a vengeful spirit may emerge not from randomness, but because of emotional neglect or betrayal within a family or community. In this way, horror is grounded in relational ethics, creating a tension that is simultaneously intimate and culturally resonant. Fear emerges as a response to human behavior, making the experience morally and psychologically multidimensional. Cultural attitudes toward death and the afterlife further distinguish Japanese horror. Death is not an endpoint, but a transition. The dead maintain influence through emotion and unresolved desires. Spirits linger because their needs were unmet, their grievances ignored, or their attachments too strong. This worldview frames supernatural encounters as morally intelligible. Fear is not arbitrary. It is tied to continuity, consequence, and relational imbalance. The audience understands that haunting is rooted in reason, even if the method is mysterious. This approach deepens engagement, encouraging reflection on mortality, responsibility, and the ethical weight of human actions. The history of theatrical and cinematic practice reinforces these principles. Edo period Kaden gatherings, kabuki, bunraku, and early film all emphasize psychological immersion over spectacle. Stories unfolded gradually, blending suggestion, moral reflection, and emotional resonance. Audiences were trained to anticipate, empathize, and internalize tension. The cumulative effect was a form of horror that operates on the mind as much as on the senses, making the experience both immediate and lingering. Modern Japanese horror continues to inherit these techniques, using narrative, visual, and auditory cues to cultivate a deeply reflective form of fear. Modern Japanese horror films such as Ringu or Ju-on demonstrate these enduring principles. The female ghost with long black hair, pale face, and gliding movement directly references traditional yurei imagery, while the narrative structure mirrors classical folklore. Suspense builds slowly, the origin of unrest is morally grounded, and the threat emerges from both psychological and supernatural dimensions. The fear is intensified by the ambiguity of the narrative and the relational consequences of human actions, keeping viewers engaged beyond the immediate moment of horror. Psychologically, this creates a distinctive form of tension. Viewers are not merely startled. They are drawn into ethical, emotional, and cognitive reflection. Fear becomes intertwined with empathy, moral reasoning, and imaginative projection. This multi-layered engagement heightens intensity while avoiding reliance on gore or shock alone. It also contributes to the enduring cultural resonance of Japanese horror. It is memorable because it engages multiple facets of human experience simultaneously. The spatial dimension of Japanese horror is also crucial. Traditional settings, forests, rivers, mountains, abandoned homes, are inherently liminal. They exist between human control and natural processes, between visibility and obscurity, between social order and solitude. The supernatural emerges most powerfully in these thresholds, where ordinary experience intersects with extraordinary possibility. Urban legends, haunted bridges, or forests like Aokigahara exemplify this principle. The environment itself amplifies psychological tension. The audience is not only observing a story, but internalizing the spatial and emotional context in which it occurs. Japanese horror also emphasizes temporality differently from Western conventions. Time in these narratives is often cyclical or suspended. Past wrongs echo into the present. Spirits are bound by unresolved history. Events may repeat, suggesting that consequences are ongoing rather than isolated. This temporal layering enhances psychological tension, as fear is not confined to the immediate moment. It persists, lingers, and intersects with memory and anticipation. Finally, Japanese horror reflects cultural acceptance of ambiguity, mortality, and ethical complexity. The absence of absolute resolution, the moral grounding of supernatural events, and the careful cultivation of psychological tension all contribute to its distinctive character. Unlike horror traditions that rely primarily on externalized monsters or immediate threat, Japanese horror prioritizes emotional resonance, moral reflection, and psychological immersion. The fear it evokes is slow, creeping, and persistent, rooted as much in understanding human behavior and emotional consequence as in supernatural spectacle. The result is a form of horror that is enduring, psychologically sophisticated, and culturally resonant. It engages the audience intellectually, emotionally, and morally, creating a tension that is both immediate and reflective. Japanese horror feels different because it is designed to be experienced internally. It operates within the mind, interacts with ethical awareness, and lingers in memory. Its impact persists long after the story ends, as the audience contemplates both the supernatural and the human conditions that gave rise to it. In conclusion, Japanese horror distinguishes itself through a unique combination of moral depth, psychological subtlety, atmospheric tension, and relational complexity. Spirits are emotionally and ethically grounded. Fear is gradual and immersive. Ambiguity sustains engagement. The supernatural is never arbitrary, but emerges from human experience, emotional imbalance, and environmental context. By emphasizing empathy, reflection, and ethical consequence alongside suspense, Japanese horror creates a multifaceted form of fear that is intimate, enduring, and profoundly human. It is not merely the story of the ghost, but the story of how human emotion, action, and memory interact with the unknown, shaping an experience of horror that resonates across centuries and mediums. In contemporary Japan, the question of whether people still believe in ghosts is complex, nuanced, and deeply intertwined with cultural identity. Superficially, one might assume that modern society, urbanized, technologically advanced, and scientifically oriented, would have little room for belief in the supernatural. Yet, even as skyscrapers rise and digital screens dominate daily life, the echoes of centuries-old folklore persist, not necessarily as literal conviction, but as a pervasive cultural lens through which the world is understood, interpreted, and emotionally navigated. Belief in ghosts, spirits, and lingering presences has evolved, adapting to modern sensibilities, while retaining the psychological and moral resonance that gave it power historically. At its core, contemporary belief in ghosts in Japan is often less about empirical proof and more about emotional truth. Ghosts function as manifestations of unresolved feelings, moral imbalance, and memory rather than as strictly physical entities. Many Japanese people do not claim to see eerie or experience hauntings firsthand, yet they recognize the symbolic reality of spirits. They understand, for instance, that anger, grief, and guilt can linger and affect the living long after death, shaping behavior, mood, and relationships. In this sense, ghosts are real in their psychological and social consequences. The lines between literal and metaphorical belief are blurred, creating a space in which the supernatural remains relevant even amid modern rationality. Traditional rituals and cultural practices continue to reinforce the presence of spirits in everyday life. Annual events such as Obon remind families to honor ancestors, lighting lanterns and offering food at household altars. Grave sites are maintained with care, memorial tablets are updated, and prayers are offered for the well-being of the departed. These practices are not universally religious. Many participants approach them as matters of respect, memory, and social cohesion rather than as acts aimed at appeasing literal spirits. Still, the rituals serve to maintain the emotional and cultural significance of spirits, reinforcing the idea that the dead are present in subtle ways, influencing the living and deserving of acknowledgement. Urban spaces in contemporary Japan also reflect a lingering awareness of supernatural presence. Sites with historical associations, abandoned buildings, forests, bridges, or former temples, retain reputations for being haunted. While young people may visit these locations as part of thrill-seeking or tourism, the underlying narratives preserve centuries of emotional and moral weight. Even the act of avoidance, consciously or unconsciously, reflect an embedded cultural understanding. Certain places carry residual energy from past tragedies, and respecting these spaces is part of maintaining social and spiritual harmony. Modern folklore, in this sense, continues to influence behavior, spatial perception, and communal practice. Popular culture has become a major vehicle for the transmission of ghostly beliefs. Horror films, anime, manga, and literature draw heavily from traditional yurei, onryo, and yokai imagery, often emphasizing psychological tension, unresolved emotion, and moral consequence over explicit violence. Works such as Ringu, Ju-on, and The Grudge have globalized Japanese horror while remaining faithful to its thematic roots. These media portray spirits as morally and emotionally grounded, allowing audiences to engage with fear in a reflective, almost meditative manner. Even viewers who approach these stories as fiction are participating in a cultural continuity that reinforces the relevance of ghosts, suggesting that belief is not binary but exists on a spectrum, blending narrative immersion, ethical reflection, and emotional resonance. Survey data and ethnographic studies highlight the spectrum of belief. While relatively few Japanese adults report direct encounters with the supernatural, many acknowledge a sense of unease in locations reputed to be haunted or express belief in spiritual influence over luck, fortune, and emotional well-being. Psychological studies suggest that these beliefs fulfill important functions. They provide frameworks for understanding misfortune, channel emotional energy, and reinforce moral and social norms. Ghosts, in this sense, are not evidence against rationality, but mechanisms for integrating ethical, emotional, and existential realities into daily life. Ghostly belief in contemporary Japan is also highly generational and context-dependent. Older generations, raised with direct exposure to oral folklore and household rituals, often integrate spirits into personal and communal consciousness naturally, treating them as real in practical and ethical terms. Younger generations, influenced by globalized media, science education, and urbanization, may engage with spirits more symbolically, appreciating the cultural, psychological, and narrative significance of ghosts without endorsing literal belief. Yet the symbolic engagement is profound. To understand the moral and emotional logic of a ghost story is to participate in centuries of cultural practice, acknowledging the unseen consequences of human action, attachment, and neglect. Psychologically, the persistence of ghostly belief can be traced to the enduring human need to account for the unexplainable, process grief, and navigate ethical uncertainty. Ghosts provide a framework for understanding how unresolved actions, betrayal, neglect, cruelty, can resonate beyond immediate perception. They externalize emotional consequences, allowing reflection and engagement with feelings that might otherwise be suppressed. For many, this function persists regardless of whether one literally expects a ghost to appear. The mental and moral structures developed around spirits remain psychologically active. There are also specific social contexts in which ghost belief becomes more pronounced. Natural disasters, accidents, or acts of violence often trigger narratives of lingering spirits, reinforcing the cultural association between tragedy and spiritual presence. Urban legends, media accounts, and shared memory of historical events converge to maintain a communal understanding of spiritual consequence. A city blocked with repeated misfortune, a forest with multiple fatalities, or a river associated with drownings may all be approached with heightened caution or reverence. Even if individual belief varies, these collective practices sustain a network of implicit acknowledgement, embedding spirits within the moral geography of the community. Modern practices also demonstrate a blending of superstition, ritual, and ethical reflection. Visiting graves, maintaining altars, or participating in Obon can be as much about self-reflection, familial responsibility, and emotional balance as about literal belief in the supernatural. Prayers for the dead are often expressions of continuity, memory, and care, reinforcing social and familial bonds. The dead are acknowledged not because their power is feared, but because neglecting them is thought to disrupt emotional and social harmony. Japanese ghost stories are a reflection of the human experience, resonating with universal themes of grief, betrayal, and unresolved emotions. But while these tales are rooted in traditional folklore, they have also evolved in response to the shifting needs and sensibilities of contemporary society. What makes these stories continue to captivate, even in modern times, is their ability to bridge the past with the present, to make ancient fears and cultural values feel relevant in a world that is increasingly dominated by technology and rationality. In contemporary Japan, while belief in ghosts may not be as widespread or as literal as it once was, the cultural significance of these stories remains potent. They provide a lens through which people can reflect on deeper psychological truths and examine the emotional complexities of human existence. Ghosts, spirits, and yokai are not simply remnants of old superstitions, but potent symbols of unresolved emotional states, guilt, fear, longing, and sorrow that continue to affect individuals and societies today. One of the most compelling aspects of Japanese ghost stories is their deep emotional resonance. Unlike Western horror films, which often focus on visceral shock, gore, and external threats, Japanese ghost stories are deeply psychological. They work on the audience not through immediate physical danger, but through a slow-building tension that taps into the unconscious. The spirits that haunt the living are often portrayed as victims, misunderstood, or wronged in life, and their restless spirits seek closure or vengeance for the wrongs they suffered. This emotional depth is key to their power. It is the unresolved grief, the unspoken guilt, or the lingering anger that give these spirits their strength and presence. They are not merely monstrous entities. They are manifestations of the emotional and moral struggles that exist in the human psyche. Take the figure of Oiwa, for example, one of the most famous spirits in Japanese folklore. Her story is one of betrayal and revenge. A woman who was disfigured by her husband's cruelty. She returns as a vengeful spirit to exact punishment on those who wronged her. Oiwa's haunting is not just a physical manifestation. It is a reflection of the deep emotional scars left by betrayal. Her appearance, her distorted face, her wild hair, reflects the anguish she endured, and her wrath is fueled not by mindless evil, but by the desire to right the wrongs done to her. The emotional underpinning of the story makes Oiwa's vengeance feel justified, even as it terrifies the audience. This is the emotional core of Japanese ghost stories. Spirits are the emotional residue of unresolved lives, and their impact on the living is as much psychological as it is supernatural. Modern interpretations of these stories continue to explore similar themes, albeit in different formats. The horror films of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, such as Ringu and Ju-on, The Grudge, are grounded in much of the same psychological tension that define traditional ghost stories. In these films, the ghosts are not simply malevolent forces, but tragic figures bound by past traumas. The central ghost in Ringu, Sadako, is driven by a desire for revenge due to the mistreatment she suffered in life. Her appearance, with long, unkempt hair and a white burial kimono, recalls the imagery of the eerie from earlier traditions. However, her haunting is not just about physical fear. It is a curse, a manifestation of her repressed rage and anguish. The curse Sadako spreads is a representation of the emotional residue she left behind when she was wronged. The more that characters try to escape the curse, the more they realize they are not merely dealing with an external threat, but confronting the unresolved emotional trauma that it represents. This shift from external horror to internal, psychological terror is reflective of broader cultural changes. Japanese society, much like the rest of the world, has undergone significant shifts since the Edo period. Modernity, industrialization, and the influence of Western thought have altered the way people live and think. However, the emotional and moral lessons embedded in traditional ghost stories continue to resonate. While the supernatural is no longer taken as literally as it once was, the themes of injustice, the consequences of human actions, and the emotional weight of guilt and grief remain as relevant as ever. The urbanization of Japan has also contributed to the transformation of ghost stories. The bustling, crowded cities of Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto have replaced the isolated villages and rural landscapes that once served as a backdrop for many of these tales. In these modern cities, ghost stories are often set against the stark, impersonal backdrop of the urban environment, where anonymity and isolation are commonplace. The vast, dense urban landscape, with its labyrinthine alleyways and towering skyscrapers, become the modern equivalent to the dark forests and haunted mountains of earlier folklore. The feeling of being watched, of something unseen lurking just beyond familiar, is just as prevalent in modern Japanese horror as it was in the past. The themes of loneliness and disconnection in modern Japan also find a parallel in the world of spirits. The rapid pace of modern life, with its emphasis on individualism and achievement, often leaves people feeling isolated. Ghosts, in this context, serve as a reflection of that isolation. The spirits are often portrayed as victims of societal neglect or personal betrayal. In films like Ju-on, the spirits are not just products of supernatural forces, but symbols of the social alienation that many people feel. The haunting is not just an external terror, but a reminder of emotional neglect, the abandonment of relationships, and the unresolved grief that builds up in a society that often values productivity over personal connection. In addition to urbanization, technology plays a significant role in the transformation of Japanese ghost stories. The internet, social media, and digital communication have created new spaces for the supernatural to emerge.